What I'm trying to do here is to locate South Africa in the broader sort of set of conversations that we've had already, because invariably, you know, we like to think that South Africa is ahead of the game in some instances, and maybe it is in certain areas, but there's still a lot of challenges that we face locally, and the particular challenges that I want to speak to are the issues of access, inclusion, and scale. Because invariably, we're spending a lot of money in South Africa around TVET and skills development. We have a very disconnected system, a very inefficient system in terms of how these two things speak to each other. We do have apprenticeships. They don't necessarily engage enough with the formal TVET system, and I'll talk a bit about that. But there is an incredible amount of money being spent, running into the hundreds of billions of rands, and I'm not going to try to convert that into euros. But I think the reality is that what we're seeing is that this is not, this in a large pot of money that we're investing in our TVET and skills system is not actually addressing issues of inclusion or issues of scale. And what we're having is large numbers of young people getting access to a TVET college system, which is not connected to the labor market, where large numbers of young people are not getting, access to the right kinds of skills and access to workplace experience. And in fact, there's a real sort of disconnect between the supply and demand. So for large numbers of young people, it's actually going through a formal TVET system in South Africa doesn't really add a lot of value to your transition, to your successful transition to the labor market. And what is more common is that young people will get into a low-skilled job. As I said, employers would rather take you off the street and train you on the job, but it's generally a low-skilled job. And you hope, there's a hope that the opportunity will emerge to progress towards a qualification, a trade over time. But usually it lands up with young people getting trapped in those low-skilled, low-paying jobs, and they're highly precarious because there's little recognition, they don't have formal training, and there are no real opportunities for progression. So we sit with a real distorted system where there's a lot of money going in, but we're not actually solving the problem. And I think it's illustrated in this slide in particular, where we're finding that despite the large, as I said, the large amounts of money going into our TVET and skills system, what we're finding is that only 6% of our young people are actually landing up in formal employment. And yes, our formal sector is larger than many other countries in the continent and in the region, but in essence, our formal sector is not labor absorbing. And particularly now with COVID, it's even less labor absorbing than it was before. We get a lot of young people that within 6 months of trying to make the transition from the TVET and skills environment into the labor market are becoming unemployed and discouraged. And yeah, some are landing up in informal employment, but it's also very, very small. So this is the disconnect that we're sitting with. What we're finding is invariably that the answer is not in the large companies. It's not in the formal large companies where we've traditionally seen apprenticeships and the like being offered. It's actually in SMEs, because as I said, our large companies are not labor absorbing, and they're definitely not labor absorbing at this level. So they will look for professionals. They will look for technicians, engineers, and the like, but they will not necessarily look for TVET level young people. People you go through a TVET system. So you have to look at alternatives on the demand side. And our TVET system has been very reliant on large companies and continues to be very reliant on large companies from a point of view of access to workplace training, apprenticeships, and even employment. And it's not actually working as we relate to the fact that large numbers of young people are not getting into those, are excluded from opportunities in those large companies. Someone asked, what does IRM stand for? Well, in this particular instance, I'm talking about the kind of jobs in the industrial economy that relate to installation, repair, and maintenance. And I'm not going to specifically talk about the installation, repair, and maintenance initiative per se, but I want to talk more about the lessons that we've generated out of this program. What we're trying to do very much here is to look at what are the alternative pathways that we can create for young people that are more inclusive, more scalable, more cost-effective into the labor market. And what we're saying is that these opportunities sit largely within the SME environment. The challenge is that the SME environment, as we've already illustrated, face a number of challenges in terms of being able to take young people in and train them and employ them. And part of what we have to be able to do is to create a more conducive environment for SMEs to be able to train. So the question that always comes up is, what is the incentive? What is the incentive for SMEs to get involved in running dual training, dual apprenticeship type programs? And in majority of cases in this country, SMEs are not involved in formal training. They are not involved in apprenticeships. The apprenticeships are expensive. They are very labor intensive to run. They are linked to 3- and 4-year qualifications, and they are very exclusive, and they're very high barriers to entry. So we need alternatives. We need to look at overcoming some of those distortions that the apprenticeship system creates. If we look at the kinds of businesses that we're talking about, and here's just an example of the plumbing industry in South Africa. If you look at there's 125,000 people working in our plumbing industry. There's only 8,000 registered plumbers, right, in that mix. 83% of the businesses are informal. So we've got a lot of people operating as plumbers, not necessarily qualified, not recognized, right, and are running informal businesses. But in that mix, you've got to say that there must be businesses there that could be show the potential to grow and to train and employ young people. So the question is, how do you unlock that potential? If you've got this kind of scale, we can offer formal apprenticeships for the small number of formal businesses out there. But what do you do if you're saying that 83% of your businesses are informal? How do you work within that system? How do you break through into an informal system when your system at the moment is largely only geared towards formal workplaces, and particularly large formal workplaces? So we have to make the conditions conducive for this large number of businesses in the informal sector to want to train and employ young people. And that's the key, and that's the key to bringing the TVET college system closer to where the jobs are or could be. If we look at it further, the reality is that this plumbing industry, and I'm just using plumbing as an example here, but it's very much a symptomatic of many of the sectors of our economy. You see that the large majority of these 125,000 odd people are either low educated, so they haven't completed a formal education, very low skills base, which means those companies are invariably unable to grow, are unable to employ and access market opportunities that can help them to actually create conditions for training and employment. So those are the kinds of breakthrough sort of things that we're trying to create. Like the rest of Africa, dual apprenticeships are gaining increasing focus in South Africa, and my colleagues from GIZ will talk more to that. But government has been, because we've had an apprenticeship system which is effectively quite elitist. As I said, it's quite it's quite there's high barriers to entry for the large majority of young people. The government took the route to try and modernize, expand an apprenticeship system within our college system, and to bring dual apprenticeships into our formal TVET system. And they did that very much by adopting, by seeking to adopt the dual apprenticeship model of the likes of Germany and Switzerland, and try to look at how they could literally plug that model into our system. They've had some early successes. They've put business associations into the driver's seat, and that's been quite important. There's strong integration of institutional training and workplace training. Colleges are actually having to employ qualified artisans to train these young people, which has not been something that they've necessarily done in the past. And that's enabled them to meet some of the industry standards, as well as equipping the training workshops in these colleges. And there's been a shift in the culture in colleges towards being more demand-led. They use this centers of specialization thing as a way of promoting the fact that they're now becoming increasingly demand-led. And I think that's good signs. I mean, there's good signs that come out of that. But there's a fundamental problem. We're putting a lot of resources and efforts in terms of integrating a dual apprenticeship model into our TVET system. It's costing us an incredible amount of money. And the problem is that it's only ever going to reach a very small number of young people. So in total, it might be a few hundred or even 1,000 a year that might get opportunities to go into the dual apprenticeship. But the reality is that we have tens of thousands of young people coming into our formal TVET system every year who are not going to get access to these opportunities. So the question is, what is the solution for the other 99% of young people who will not get into this, into a dual apprenticeship, a formal dual apprenticeship? And this is the kinds of things that we have to tackle. It means finding a model that can lower the barriers to entry, that can be more amenable for your SME environment, which, as I said, is largely informal, right? That can be more cost effective, and can have larger scale. And I think that for me is the nub of if we have to say what are the key principles that we have to focus on if we want to really achieve inclusion and accessibility, that we have to concentrate on some of these principles. But we face similarly the constraints to implementing your dual apprenticeships that you face elsewhere in the region. Dual apprenticeships or apprenticeships bring with them high levels of regulation and structure and minimum standards, which SMEs struggle to meet. Informal SMEs are particularly ill-equipped to operate fully formal apprenticeships because of infrastructure, because of the skills of the business owners. They're not necessarily suitably qualified to meet the standards of training. There's opportunity costs that are associated with disruptive productivity if they're having to train young people. There's a pervasive disconnect between the formal TVET system and workplace training, particularly in these SMEs. So formal TVET is not geared to training young people for the SME environment. And the incentives that we use with the formal apprenticeship system actually distort our labor market, because it means that your larger companies can be much more are training because they can access incentives rather than because they can create more jobs. They are also training for their own needs, and they are putting very high barriers to entry. So if you want to go into an apprenticeship, you have to meet very high standards for entry, including your educational qualifications, etc. You have to have high access to networks. That means that the large majority of young people are never going to get access to those opportunities. So we put a strong focus on the role of industry associations, because if you're dealing with this large number of SMEs, whether they're formal or informal, you can't, to tackle each one of them individually is really quite difficult, right? You need a lot of resources and a lot of time. So we rely very heavily on the role of industry associations and partnering with industry associations to play that central role of overcoming some of these constraints on the demand side through doing a number of things. One is around, understanding the demand. What is the demand for skills within the SME environment, within the companies that they're working with? What are the kinds of recognition frameworks we need for skills outside of the current system? Because we're not this, and I think the Kenya example I think it was Kenya or Mozambique, is very good in that we're not talking about 3-year qualifications when we're talking to SMEs. We're not talking about extended learning programs when we're talking to SMEs. We need programs that are shorter, that are much more geared to the needs of the SME environment, and that can still lead to recognition. So industry associations play an important role in creating the kind of appropriate frameworks for recognition and credentialing in the SME environment that are conducive and that are appropriate for the SME environment. They also can help with promoting the appropriate curricula. So they've been working with us around designing the right kind of curricula that would be appropriate for those environments, creating the right, finding mechanisms for funding and incentives, finding, supporting enterprises, those very enterprises around how they can create effective learning environments, making sure that young people that are ready, so these young people that have been picked up off the street and have been trained on the job but not formally trained, making sure that their skills can be formalized so that you don't bring in young people through apprenticeships that are being better trained and push out young people who are already working there that are not properly trained or properly recognized. And then, but still opening opportunities for new entrants into those SMEs. So it's about creating a whole set of conditions in that industry for SMEs to be more empowered or more enabled to be able to train and employ young people. So what we've learned is that we know that these SMEs, these large numbers of informal SMEs that we're talking to, face a number of inherent barriers to market access, to growth and sustainability, and that's common across the region and the world, in the developing world. So how do we incentivize SMEs to participate in training and employment of young people? What is the thing that's going to enable us to exploit the full potential of this informal sector for dual apprenticeship type programs? And what we say, what we have been doing is testing out how you can provide, not just understand demand, not just try and align programs, but in fact put in place the necessary support for those businesses to overcome some of the barriers that they face. So while you are doing the development of curricula and appropriate skills for young people, you're simultaneously focusing on developing the enterprise themselves. And this becomes an incentive. So if you're saying to businesses that we can provide you with the necessary support that will help you to get greater access to technology, access to market, access to finance, help you to become more sustainable, help you to become a stronger enterprise. That creates an incentive for you to need more skills, for you to need to be to have increased productivity in your workplace. And the commitment from that enterprise needs to be that if we provide you with all the support, we require you to then train and employ our young people that are coming through our TVET system, and in training them through a dual approach. So, and the key to that, the theory of change that we're working on, is that if you want to really achieve that, you need to identify the real entrepreneurial business owners out there. And in this case, in our case, we're talking specifically to artisans, but it applies across a variety of different sectors. How do you identify the real entrepreneurial business owners in the informal sector? Because those are the ones that are likely to be willing to grow, to take on risk, to train and employ young people, and you can incentivize them because they can see the value of training. They can see the value of having higher skills, having higher productivity. So as they're growing, they can recognize the importance of training and the importance of employing young people. So this enterprise development support to these entrepreneurs becomes an incentive for taking on young apprentices. And it creates the kind of necessary demand conditions for good quality apprenticeships to be implemented. So on the supply side, we need to design appropriate pathways, dual pathways, that will then fit the kinds of conditions that we've created in these SMEs. So you need to have programs that are shorter, that are more geared to the kinds of roles that young people are going to engage with in SMEs, that prioritize employment over qualifications. They can provide a route to qualifications, but the obsession with qualifications often hampers the route to jobs, because jobs and qualifications are not necessarily equitable and do not necessarily coincide. all the time. But we still want to create an opportunity for young people to be qualified. So we prioritize access to jobs, which just means these shorter skills programs are more geared to workplace access, to training on the job, but can provide a route to qualifications. You need to change the conditions in the TVET, informal TVET, to be able to work with SMEs, both informal and informal, build the capacity of those formal TVET institutions to deliver these kinds of dual skills interventions. So even though they're not qualifications, even though they're not full apprenticeships, they are delivered through a dual approach. We adopt a very strong project-based approach and strong project-based assessment approach. We make sure that we simulate the workplace environment as much as possible in the institution, but we also link the institution very strongly to the enterprise, so that there's a sharing of lessons, experience, and that there's a meeting of minds in terms of how training must happen. Then you need the role of intermediary organizations, and I'm running out of time, so I can't spend too much time on this. But I think it's quite important, is that often with these labor market failures that you're dealing with, it's often you need intermediary organizations that can play that role of facilitating the engagement between supply and demand. It doesn't always happen organically. Government can't always do it because they've got their own priorities that they've got to do it. So we actually try to enable intermediary organizations to work both with the TVET system and with the workplaces, these SMEs, to match the supply of skills to these opportunities and make sure that there's an effective transition from the one to the other. And finally, you need some kind of sustainable funding mechanism where you're combining your fiscus-based funding, which is what invariably will go into your formal TVET system, with the kind of levy-based and other sorts of funding mechanisms for the workplace training component. And this is the way that you can make training, levies, and fiscal funding pots, voucher systems, and other sorts of things work more effectively by bringing these two things together. Let the fiscus concentrate on formal TVET and making sure that that's operating effectively, but shift the focus towards programs that are more geared to demand, particularly in the informal SMEs that I've spoken to, and then bring in your levy-based funding to fund more the workplace training component.